introduce yourself and get going on what you'd like to say to us.
Thank you so much, Marcus. And it's lovely to see some familiar faces and great green heroes on the call that I know of or know well, and also some new faces. So thanks so much for having me this evening. By day, I look after Wildlife and Countryside Link, which is a coalition of 89 nature charities doing legislation and policy work around Westminster to try and get the government to be a little bit greener, or a lot greener, to be honest. And one of the things that we've been doing at Link over the last few years is experimenting in moving away from our traditional territory of thinking in small policy working groups about great detailed policy proposals that nobody ever hears about, to doing that at the same time as doing some big public campaigning. And it just so happens that this evening is just about a year on from one of our big experiments in public campaigning for nature, the Restore Nature Now March. I don't know if any of you guys were with us on that day. It was a happy hot day in the run up to the general election a year ago, when the atmosphere around the country was excited and febrile. Everybody was ready for the election, trying to figure out who we could trust with the future of our natural environment. And by between 60 and 80,000 people gathered in central London to raise their banners, raise their voices, do silly dances, dress up in great green garb, and ask government to take action to restore nature now. If you weren't there, it was quite an amazing scene, really. There were Morris dancers skipping alongside Rivers campaigners. There were bankers holding hands with XR activists. Wild Justice lined up alongside National Trust. It was really quite a day of unity and strength of message from all sorts of different folk, saying to the parties who are going into the general election, we might be from different walks of life. We might be from different ethnicities, socioeconomic backgrounds. We might be from different political persuasions, but we all want you to finally take the action that we need to restore nature now. And the big theme of that march a year ago was to ask government to take the action that would really be needed if it was serious about not just halting, but beginning to reverse the decline of biodiversity by the end of 2030, which is both a target in domestic law in the Environment Act and something that the UK is signed up to under the Convention on Biological Diversity, its 2030 mission, to halt and begin to reverse the decline of nature by the end of this decade. And when you think about that target, it's quite something, isn't it, really? We've been in a situation where nature has been in chronic decline for probably centuries. We know very well that nature has been in pretty precipitous decline since 1970, when lots of the really good records began. And the curve hasn't really steadied that much over recent years. We're still going down. The stats that you can find in the State of Nature report really hit home hard, especially for England, where State of Nature reported that I think it was 32% of species abundance had been lost in England since 1970. So some pretty steep declines. And we're asking the political parties to not just stop that decline, but begin to bend the curve by the end of this decade. So Restore Nature Now is about saying, what would it really take to do that? And the things that we ask the political parties for were things that will be really familiar to you guys. First and foremost, invest in nature-friendly farming. We reckoned that probably the budget that we spend to support nature-friendly farming in England and around the UK now is about half of what the science would suggest is actually needed to help meet the statutory targets. So that was ask number one. Number two was to do 30 by 30. So alongside that great promise of halting nature's decline by 2030, the sort of action target is to protect 30% of land and sea by the end of the decade. So the Restore Nature Now March was about saying, let's get our protected areas into good condition to help us meet that 30% target. Let's protect more areas with new designations, and let's make sure that some of those areas that aren't working for nature right now could be, like national parks and AONBs, start to focus not just on landscape and beauty, but on biodiversity and nature recovery too. We asked government to realise that this wasn't just about nature, but it's about people too, and that frankly, people die faster because of nature deprivation, because of the state of our natural environment here in the UK. Is it 33,000 deaths, premature deaths a year from air pollution now, we think? The burden on the NHS from lack of access to natural green space in terms of physical ill health is a huge one. And of course, water quality too. We know that unfortunately, people are literally getting sick from the bacteria loads that they find when they go swimming in our rivers and seas. So it's a health issue too. So we asked for nature to be a human right, that everybody should have access to a high quality natural environment. And fourth, we said, let's make the polluters pay. We knew that there were going to be tough financial times ahead and that the public funds couldn't cover everything. And so, of course, the private sector has to do more to invest in nature's recovery. Sometimes that makes people go, get the jitters. I think we're going to start talking about offsetting and allowing companies to greenwash their way out. No, we're talking about strong regulations to make polluters disclose the damage they cause to nature, plan to turn it around and invest in nature's recovery. And the gap there is really startling. The Green Finance Institute, if you haven't seen it, reckon probably minimum £4.4 billion investment gap in nature's recovery every year for the next 10 years if we're going to start to halt that decline in nature. So those were our asks on the day as we gathered and sang and marched, and people dressed as lobsters or green men. It was invest in wildlife friendly farming, do 30 by 30, make nature a right for everyone, and make sure that polluters pay. Of course, funny thing about those big marches is you end up in Westminster with a stage full of people making impassioned speeches to the politicians to change stuff. And of course, they're all on holiday. Nobody's there. Hopefully, the message gets out there that this is an issue that is not a minority issue in the public mind. It's an issue that should be an electoral issue, should be a political issue throughout parliaments. And so when it came to manifestos, all of the parties, all of the major parties were falling over themselves to make some quite bold nature commitments. And into that gap came the Labour Party. I won't say whether their manifesto was the best of them all, but it did have some pretty big promises for our natural environment. And the contrast, I think, the Labour Party was trying to make in its manifesto was, we'll be the ones who do it. They set up the picture of the previous government as the one that had set targets, as the one that had thought about frameworks and governance, the one that had made promises for nature that had never delivered. And Labour presented itself as the government that would come in and deliver where others had failed. I think the manifesto said it would meet the Environment Act targets and other nature targets where previous governments failed. And there was there is some truth in the characterization of the previous government as one that was spending a lot of time doing framework legislation, doing target setting. We had those three linchpin pieces of legislation: the Environment Act that set the world's first target to halt the decline of nature, the Agriculture Act that set in place the new promise of public money for public goods. So instead of paying farmers for how much land they have, paying farmers to deliver public goods like nature recovery and carbon sequestration and flood risk alleviation. And then the third of the three, the Fisheries Act, setting up the post-Brexit framework for fisheries management, which was supposed to make sure that we move to a state of sustainable fisheries management and marine recovery. And all those pieces of legislation were really designed in part to fill the gap that Brexit had left in terms of governance of our natural environment and a legislative framework for nature here in the UK. And it was a necessary task to fill that gap and to start to set out new ambition for the UK's approach to the natural environment. But we knew all the while we were spending on reshaping those governance frameworks that the actual work of investing in habitat creation, in species management and recovery, in pollution abatement wasn't happening at speed. And the Office for Environmental Protection, the new watchdog set up by the Environment Act, was pretty clear in its end of term report for the government that the government was off track in almost every natural environment target area that it had set itself when it came to actual delivery of the steps needed to turn around nature's decline. So against that sort of picture of a government of target setting, a government of catching up with the pre-Brexit world, a government focused on promises, the Labour government said it would be the one that would come in and deliver. And indeed, it responded to another action that we were doing at that time. Link brought its first ever judicial review against the government at the end of the last government's term about its environmental improvement plan. Our contention was that the environmental improvement plan should have been reviewed in light of the Office for Environmental Protection's report that they weren't succeeding. And one of the Labour government's first acts was to say, yes, we will review the environmental improvement plan because we are the government of action and we will turn around nature's decline. It's a great setup, isn't it? To have that framing as being a government of action. Sadly, sadly, it wasn't long before in delivery, the wheels came off and the new government found itself moving away from its pre-election focus on sustainable growth, hand in hand with nature recovery, to one where at various points it's felt like it's become growth at all costs, with the post-election economic situation making Sir Keir's government focused more and more single-mindedly on its GDP score, on growth, and on that what has become overarching mission of getting Britain growing again. And that's come at the expense of action on nature. Yes, there have been a few good things, and we shouldn't forget to rehearse them, because there have been some really nice little gems, if you like, in the mix. We've had the closure of the sand eel fishery. Great! Everyone loves puffins. Sand eels are really important. Super duper. Also at sea, we've had, at last, the promise to continue the programme of stopping bottom trawling in our marine protected areas. In the terrestrial environment, we've had beaver releases at long last, and the guidance for new beaver releases. We've had properly banning neonicotinoids. We've had closing some of the loopholes on heat burning, and we've got more promises in the works with things like the land use framework. But there are 3 or 4 big areas where, if the government really wanted to deliver that 2030 target, sadly, the level of effort has fallen far below what we think it needs to, and in some cases, they're heading in completely the wrong direction. So to spin through those, I guess the biggest ones in our world are development and planning. So apologies to those who were with us in the Methodist Church in Oxford the other day, because I can't escape nobbling on again about the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which is one of the great threats on the horizon. Water, where all the parties made such a play of their promises to tackle water pollution. Labour government may be foremost among them. How are we doing on that one? Public spending, and particularly on nature-friendly farming, and then that sort of overarching picture of the environmental improvement plan and how the government is going for nature-friendly growth. If it's not too terribly tiresome, I'll spin through those and give you a sense of where I think we are on each of them. Why don't we start with farming, because it's one of the areas where, if we're actually going to make that difference and halt nature's decline, it's absolutely essential that farmers are at the vanguard. At the moment, we have to be honest, farming is one of, or has been, one of the foremost drivers of biodiversity loss for decades, particularly in the period of more rapid intensification. We saw fairly large-scale habitat destruction. We saw hedgerows and trees being taken out of fields, ponds being filled in. We saw more intensive inputs of nutrient loads in field, herbicides, pesticides used in field, damaging pollination services. We saw compaction and over abstraction, and the results have been clear in the Farm and Bird Index, which has been one of the most rapidly declining of our indices of nature's health in the UK. But saying that is not to diminish the brilliance of many nature-friendly farmers, and indeed the determination of some of those who, despite the fact that the incentives and the rules have often pointed in the wrong direction, and have been encouraging that over-intensification and focus on production alone, have managed to carve out a niche in regenerative farming and nature-friendly farming. People like the Nature-Friendly Farming Network, and many of those who work with them here in Oxfordshire, the brilliant Golds, and Andy Cato down the road from me, and lots and lots we've got to celebrate. But the government's approach on nature-friendly farming so far has been nowhere near where it needs to be to drive the support nature-friendly farmers need to be brave, to drive an increase in the baseline for all farmers in general, and to make sure that enforcement of the rules actually happens. So the envelope of spending in the spending review for nature-friendly farming was just about maintained at just over a couple of billion quid a year for the farming budget. It's not as bad as it could have been, but it's nowhere near what it should be to properly support farmers in investing in nature's recovery. And behind that, we've seen the government pause access to the entry-level scheme for nature-friendly farming, the Sustainable Farming Incentive. It really did need fixing, because the previous government had left it in a situation where it was a complete pick and mix approach, where farmers could choose whatever option they wanted from dozens and dozens and dozens of different options without any spatial targeting and without any sense of what packages might work on a particular farm in a particular area. But this government, sadly, instead of moving forward to quickly reform it and make sure that the SFI was well targeted and available to everyone, has unfortunately paused it instead. And we've seen a lot of distress among farmers who were planning their business changes on the basis of access to that scheme. The sort of more ambitious schemes have also ground somewhat to a halt. So agri-environment schemes, those that target investment in the most nature-friendly options, The number of contracts that we're seeing given out for those schemes is far below what it was just a few years ago. And when it comes to enforcement, we're still in a situation where, despite some extra investment in the Environment Agency's capacity to go out and check what's going on farm, we're still in a situation where about half of farms are non-compliant on some of the most basic and important pollution prevention rules, like upkeep of their slurry storage. And the levels of non-compliance of things like the farming rules for water remain really high. And that's a mix both of the abilities of the agencies to go out and police it, the simplicity of the law for farmers to understand, and the availability of advice for farmers to know what's going on. So we're kind of in a pause and review moment for farming, but if there's going to be any hope of meeting those nature recovery targets, then it's absolutely incumbent on this government to make sure that it gets those schemes up and running quickly in a more targeted fashion, so that the farmers who are being bravest and boldest in nature recovery actions get paid not just the cost of the actions that they're taking, which has been the Treasury's approach up until now, but are paid generously to be really brave and bold in their nature recovery action. From farming to planning, the other big land use issue. It started out so terribly badly, didn't it? Wendy was recalling as we gathered today the awful antagonistic inaccuracy of the bat tunnel scapegoating, scapebatting, if you like, of species for standing in the way of house building targets. The bats were first to get it in the neck. Newts had a little go again. The poor old distinguished jumping spider was in the target line at one point. And really, the government poisoned the ground for any hope of planning reforms where we could trust that their approach was anywhere near a win-win for nature and development, which is what ministers were at the same time as the Prime Minister is out bat beating, with saying they wanted to get win-wins for nature and development. And into that toxic atmosphere came the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. And within that bill, I guess we have to understand that the government's growth mission is predicated on getting stuff in the ground. They think that infrastructure development and housing, as well as being a social priority for them, is also a growth priority. And the government is desperate to do anything it can to unblock, as it sees, housing development. The irony, of course, is that there is no evidence at all that it's nature rules that are standing in the way of development at scale. We have to be honest, sometimes nature rules do slow down development. But Natural England says that of the development applications it's consulted on, 99% go through without an objection. And over the last few years, only a small handful of major infrastructure projects have typically been delayed by environmental concerns. So the Planning and Infrastructure Bill starts from a false premise that if you take away environmental regulation, you are likely to get more housing. Nevertheless, there are some bits in it that are good. So let's think about what it does. The Planning and Infrastructure Bill, if you haven't been following it, is the government's attempt to make it easier for developers to discharge their legal responsibilities for protected sites and protected species. So it's affecting the way that the habitats regulations and the Wildlife and Countryside Act protect nature sites, SSSIs, SACs, SPAs, or protected species, otters, bats, birds. And what it would do is allow Natural England come up with something called an environmental delivery plan that would set out for an area an envelope of development that would be allowed within the plan area and allow developers who want to undertake development in that area that would affect protected site or species in that area to simply pay a nature restoration levy. And that levy will then be used to fund conservation actions which are intended to more than outweigh harm to the protected feature. So there are some good things in there. There really are. The good ideas that we would like to just grasp and cradle and take out are that actually we can spend developer contributions for nature better than we do now. Right now, those of you who are involved with local planning will know so often when developer contributions are needed to compensate for harm to nature, you get investment in some poxy little bit of habitat that ticks a box and is done and has no sort of added benefits, has no sort of strategic connection to the ecology of the area, and might not really do that much good for nature. There's a good idea in the planning and infrastructure bill that actually, if we pool those funds, we can invest them in the Lawton priorities of nature that's bigger, better, and more joined up. We could do some really exciting and cool stuff by taking that money, pooling it, and using it for bigger, better stuff in a more targeted fashion. The second sort of good bit of the planning bill is that it promises to do for protected sites and species what net gain has done for nature at large, to move beyond offsetting to actually invest in nature's recovery. At the moment, the law just requires parity, and the proposal is that in future, under environmental delivery plans, protected feature should actually end up better than it started out. And that's good for nature, obviously. It's also good for development because you might start to solve some of those underlying issues that are causing the law to kick in the first place. But unfortunately, somewhere in the translation from ministers' minds to the legislative page, those good things got lost in some very bad law. And I won't labour the points because some of you have heard me make them before, but the law is really deficient in three main areas. First of all, it's lost the mitigation hierarchy. So that absolutely fundamental principle of environmental planning that first you should avoid harm, then you should reduce harm and mitigate it. And only then should you move to a compensatory approach. Under the bill, there's no snifter of the mitigation hierarchy. Once the developer has paid their nature restoration levy, they can walk away and move straight to the compensatory approach. That's unacceptable, and we need to put back something like a priority to avoid harm into the bill. The second is the strength of legal certainty of outcomes. So at the moment, under the law, there's a pretty iron-cast guarantee that if there is an adverse effect on a protected site or species, the developer has to secure steps that will, beyond reasonable scientific doubt, compensate for that harm. In the bill, it plays a vanishing trick, and that sort of legal liability, instead of being transferred from the developer to the government, vanishes and is replaced just by ministerial opinion. So a plan has to be likely to succeed in the opinion of the Secretary of State. If it's not working, the plan may have backup measures that may be taken if the Secretary of State thinks it's a good idea. And if a plan completely fails and has to be revoked, then the Secretary of State only has to undertake measures that he or she considers appropriate, taking into account economic and social considerations. So in other words, everything goes from being a strict legal guarantee testable in court to something that's there in the opinion of the Secretary of State, which, as we all know, is practically impossible to assess and practically impossible to challenge in the courts. So those three weaknesses in particular leave the government's planning proposals as perhaps the most potentially destructive change in environmental planning law for decades, and could fundamentally weaken the protections for designated sites and species that we've all come to rely on. I promise not to witter on for too much longer, but just to give you a little flavour of the other two uh, areas that are a priority that might be of interest to you guys. On water, as I said, all the political parties made great play of their fury of the millions of hours of raw sewage being pumped into our uh, rivers, lakes, streams, and coastlines, and absolutely right. And that fury that came from all political parties was matched only by the complete lack of solutions that any of the parties had for what they were going to do about it, unfortunately. Um, and Well, how has Labour done? Well, to be fair, Mr. Reid has continued to make this a priority, and he quickly introduced the Water Special Measures Bill, which has helped to make things like rapid fines for water companies to work more swiftly, and has introduced some largely symbolic but still important limitations on things like bonuses for bosses in the event of water pollution. And alongside that, the government has begun work on things like the rules for diffuse water pollution to prevent harm from the agriculture sector to our rivers. And it's something that Labour continues to say is a priority for them. We are in a situation of being on hold, really, at the moment, because as so often, this government's approach to action in that area has been to set up a commission, the Independent Water Commission, that's looking at the problems in the water system at the moment and coming up with its recommendations. The Commission released its interim report a few weeks ago now. I should declare an interest because I'm notionally an advisor to the Commission, but I don't know really whether I have any influence or usefulness at all. So that's my disclaimer. But the things that the Commission is looking at the moment are a new level of regional systems planning. So new bodies to direct investment in the water environment at that regional level so that you can join up the massive gap that there is between national targets and local delivery. This is a good idea, but it needs to go much further in terms of the powers that's vested in that new body to be able to actually control planning and spending and decision making in each catchment so that stuff actually happens. The Commission is looking at a new supervisory approach to water company finances. So one of the great outrages that you'll all know better than I do of the last 50 years since privatization has been the water company's ability to borrow against public asset base, take out dividends and value from the water sector at the same time as underinvesting in the assets actually service the water sector, whether it's the leaky pipes that service our homes or the sewage treatment works that are meant to control the quality of our outflows, or the combined sewer overflows that so often lead to that pollution incidents. The Commission's view is that the best way to tackle that, ruling out public ownership, is to have a much greater presence from the regulator, from Ofwat and the Environment Agency in the fabric of the water company's financial decision making, so that they're sitting there watching what the water companies do and trying to make sure that when they make their investment plans, they do so not just in the private interest, but also in the public interest. And then the Commission is also thinking about the future of the strategic direction of the water industry. So the targets that come after we are bound to abjectly fail on our Water Framework Directive targets, in which of 2027, by the way, we're meant to have 75% of our waters in good condition. We're on 14% at the moment. So the Commission is thinking about the future of that targets framework and how the government can make it clearer that cleaning up our water environment has to be a strategic priority and not just minimization of politically convenient lower bills. So that's water. And very finally, on the sort of polluter pays approach, well, this to me is one of the areas that no government has yet been brave enough on. Uh, in the climate field, after the Climate Change Act, there was that wonderful exercise in electricity market reform where the government worked out that it needed whatever it was, I think it was 110 billion pounds by 2020 to reshape the electricity sector. And then it said, who's going to pay and what policies do we need to make them do so? And we came up with the policies like the carbon price floor and the contracts for difference and the feed-in tariffs and the renewables obligation and all those things that passed on responsibility from the government to the private sector in a way that was rigorous, well enforced, and drove investment from the polluters into remediating the problem. We have nothing like that in the nature sector to speak of. There are a couple of very small compliance markets. There are biodiversity net gain, where the government is busy pulling the rug out of the market by proposing to take out small sites, which are responsible for 70% of the demand. And then nutrient neutrality, where new housing development has to compensate for the extra pollution load that it would cause in nutrient sensitive catchments by paying for reductions elsewhere. And again, that one's up in the air because of the planning and infrastructure bill. So the last government and this one have largely been focused on thinking about how to set standards for nature markets under the sort of, in my opinion, vain impression that if you set standards, the private sector will step up by itself. I think there's a strong case to be made that if the government is going to fill that £4 to £5 billion nature gap, finance gap a year that I spoke of earlier, it's got to do so by making polluters pay. And there's a consultation open right now about nature markets, where I hope everybody will speak with a single voice to say that the only way that you're going to get serious investment from all of those sectors that are implicated in major problems, agriculture, development, chemicals, you've got to do it on a regulatory basis and make them pay. That is a whole load of stuff. And Marcus, I have no idea whether that was a complete soporific adventure in boring policy stuff. The main reason for telling you that stuff is to see what you think, because that might be completely wrong, but also to say none of those things are a finished exercise. The planning and infrastructure bill is going through Parliament now, and every letter that an MP gets will make a difference, whatever party they're from and whatever their view now. That mailbag politics really works to pass on the pressure that we need to make the government concede to our amendments later down the line. So please write to them. On farming and agriculture, well, first and foremost, we need to find those nature-friendly farmers that are our champions and give them a big hug and help them and show that we know that they're champions and are alongside them. But make sure that when it comes to the next stages of farming reform, that we're equally explicit that pollution mustn't pay and that enforcement needs to happen, but also that farmers need to be more than compensated and generously rewarded for the action that they take. On the Water Commission, again, we're in a formative mode. The interim report has been published, but there's still a chance to shape the final report. I would encourage everybody to write in and say, Commission, don't be timid. Let's have regional system planners that can actually stop pollution and not just encourage reduction. Let's have new targets that don't dismantle and hide from the problems of the Water Framework Directive, but drive new ambition. And when it comes to this point about private sector investment in nature, well, I think we all need to gather our acts and realise that we can no longer rely on the public finances alone, whether it's on the Nature for Climate Fund or the tree planting funds that we've relied on, or the nature-friendly farming funds. And actually, we need to speak in one voice, preferably with business, to say that it's time for serious regulatory requirements for major polluters to start paying for nature recovery. We'll be doing Restore Nature Now again next year. We hope you'll come and join us in the streets once more. And if you can, then I hope that by then, we might have fixed some of those problems. We'll say that the jury is still out for the Labour government on whether they will be the first government to turn around the decline in nature. But these initial days have been not at the pace they need, and sometimes marching in the wrong direction. So there's a lot of work yet to do if they want to meet that big promise.
Thank you. That was certainly not soporific. If anything, the opposite. That was a really bracing overview, really quite shocking. Am I allowed to kick off with an initial question? How much would you put it down to bad intent versus how much is it the cock-up versus the conspiracy?
I think maybe some of it was naivety about thinking that actually nature was quite an easy thing to fix. And when you're in campaigning mode in front of an election, it's very easy to say we will sort water pollution, and only when you get into this chair of government do you realize actually some of that requires some pretty hard choices. And I think those choices have proven too tough so far for the government, but may yet turn around. I think there have been big changes. The Chancellor likes to say it, but we are in a new world when it comes to public finances, and that has been a tricky one. We're also in a new political world where some of the woeful retreat on things like net zero and the cross-party consensus on climate change action has started to bleed over into other environmental issues. And I won't, I don't know the politics of it, but it might be that some chasing after some of that anti-net zero, anti-environmental vote has caused the government to go in the wrong direction. Much, we might say, against broader public opinion, but it's a very alluring new movement, I suppose. And then I guess part of it has been just that that political positioning has felt more convenient to be able to say that growth is the most important thing and to create enemies to strike down. And nature, unfortunately, became one of those punch bags. I think they can still turn it round, but I think there've been a few circumstances. I should also say, sorry, I keep going on. I should also say I think it's also because our movement hasn't done the job it should have done in some places. We've got an amazing nature movement, and individual campaigns are fantastic. And some of the grassroots momentum that we've built around river campaigning is absolutely brilliant. But what I don't think we do well enough as a movement is identify the big systemic changes that we want, the opportunities to make those a year in advance, and campaign in a concerted and consistent and loud fashion soon enough. We should have known that the planning bill was coming, and we should have been the ones setting the framing for how that bill would roll out. Instead, it was Britain Remade who stepped into that space and made it about fish discos and bat tunnels and all those other misrepresentations of the truth. I think actually we could do a better job about saying next year we know there'll be a water bill. Let's make sure that we set the public conversation about the massive measures that are needed in there to sort out our river environment. So let's do that.
Thank you, Richard. So I know people have questions. I've got a hand from Wendy, and I'll open up the floor to other people who've got questions. I know that there will be many.
Richard, thank you very much for for everything that you've said. How can we get the government to invest in the Environment Agency and Natural England? Because I work a lot with the Environment Agency through my work with the Thames Path National Trail, and they are so hamstrung by everything. They have no money, barely, to do the essential work of running the rivers and making sure that flood schemes go ahead and all the rest of it, which are absolutely fundamental. And there is this new piece of planning guidance called Enabling a Natural Capital Approach. And I found it on the government website, and I'm using it at a public inquiry next month. But nobody seems to be using that either. We're not using a natural capital approach. And I think our organizations, you talk about the organizations that need to be working together, we need to be speaking the same language and lobbying in the same way. But investing in the Environment Agency and investing in Natural England are absolutely fundamental to stopping pollution, all sorts of other things, because they're good people at the agency, but they're just not enough of them to do their job properly.
Yeah, you raised 2 points really there, Wendy, that are very connected in my mind. So the guidance point, if if at some point link becomes too difficult for me, I'd quite like to write a little book about non-compliance in environmental law, because I think one of the things that has plagued us for so long is the assumption that everything about nature is sort of soft guidance, and our laws and targets are, you know, nice to haves. You see targets come and go and being missed. You see regulations being ignored in return for a slap in the wrist, and you see duties going into bills that have regard duties or have a nice think about duties that end up with guidance that, when you've got hard pressed local authorities and whatever, they just fall to the bottom of the list, don't they? And I think that is really connected to your main point there, which is the capacity of the regulators to actually do their job. Natural England hasn't visited, is it 2/3 of triple SIs in the last decade or something like that? There's that classic WWF statistic of a farm can expect to be inspected once every 200 years on average. It's complete asymmetrical warfare out there with when it comes to the chances of anybody really being held to account for environmental non-compliance. And unfortunately, one of the things I didn't mention just now is that it's likely to get worse. So one of the documents alongside the spending review was called, I've forgotten its exact title. It's something about efficiencies. And the reason that DEFRA was able to say that it's made its biggest investment in wildlife friendly farming, tree planting, and peat protection is because all the cuts that fell on DEFRA, which were some of the biggest for any department, fall largely on the shoulders of the regulators. So it's going to get worse, Wendy. We did some quick maths on spending review day, and we reckoned that by the third year of the spending review, 75% of the expected DEFRA cuts have to come from the arm's length bodies. So what can we do about that? Well, I'm not sure. Part of the reason that the planning reforms are so precarious and on a knife edge is because Natural England is going to have to be able to do them. So if you're writing to the government about the planning reforms, please remember to say, and Natural England doesn't stand a chance of doing this, let alone its other core statutory functions, if it doesn't get invested in. For the Environment Agency, I suppose the live docking point is the Water Commission again, and if people are engaging with that process, being able to say there's absolutely no point reshaping catchment regulations if the Environment Agency isn't actually able to go out and police these things. And the more people can help to highlight those failures in enforcement, the better. I think some communities have done some really brilliant freedom of information work about how often post-development checks have taken place, how often their particular stretches of river have been monitored. And those illustrations from engaged communities of the complete wild west of the lack of enforcement of environmental law really help us to make that case for investment. And I should just give a shout out very finally to Unchecked, who are a great charity who keep an eye on these things, and they're not a link member, so I can be as nice to them as I like. They do amazing work, so check them out and give them some love too.
Thanks, Richard. I've got a hand from Rosie.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. That was so, and especially what you just said about compliance and enforcement. I mean, poor, lack of enforcement and planning as well is just quite outrageous. But anyway, what I was going to ask was back to what when you were talking about water, and I didn't quite understand what you were saying about Ofwat being like with them. What do you mean Ofwat on the board? Or I mean, could you explain what you meant by that a bit more when you said that the regulators would be more involved? I mean, that was a proposal.
So I think the idea is an idea taken from the new approach to banking after the banking scandal, where the regulator becomes more embedded in companies in terms of having more access to their books, so they're able to keep an eye on what kind of capital is going into a company. Is it the sort of slow, steady capital that you need to make fair returns, or is it the sort of cash in and cash out fast capital that we so often needed? It's people from the regulators being embedded with the water companies to oversee their financial management and make sure that they do a good job in the public interest. I think that's quite a good idea, but I can see that it could work. I do have worries about regulatory capture though, and whether that's going to lead inevitably to the companies having to pay for the people because it's expensive, and then people's jobs being dependent on saying the things that the companies want to hear. So I say this because I hope the final report will be able to be a bit braver about some of the boundaries that will be needed to make sure that that doesn't turn into a very expensive way of creating more regulatory capture.
Thank you.
Thank you. Catherine? Owen? You have a question, Catherine? I think you're still silent. You're not coming up as muted, but your sound is not working, I think. Perhaps you could put it in the chat if your sound is not working.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. My question is regarding your point that every letter an MP gets will make a difference.
Maybe that was optimistic.
Sorry?
Maybe that was slightly optimistic, but generally it's a very good thing to do.
So, yeah, you need to be optimistic. Would you like to not recommend but suggest a really good letter that I can?
You mean like a template letter?
Like, I mean, I'm sure that, you kind of select the best from different letters. You see what I mean? An example.
Right now, the thing we could really do with people writing to the government, to their MP on is planning reform. And just saying, I'm really worried about this, perhaps saying why you care, and then saying, please make sure that whatever you do doesn't weaken the law and actually leads to better legal protection for nature. Even saying that much would be great.
Really?
It would.
Yeah.
Are
Sorry.
you, where are you based again? Did you say, Catherine?
We're in Oxford.
Chris Church has just done a letter on behalf of
Okay.
the Oxford group on exactly this subject to Peers for the Planet that he's been sharing with people, and it's really good. So
Right.
perhaps I'll if you haven't got it, Marcus, I'll send it round.
Yeah,
I'll
yes,
just
please. Yes. Just
I'll
something,
circulate that to the Trees Collaborate group. That's a really good tip. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, to move on to Julian.
Yeah, hi, Richard. Thanks a lot for
Hello.
giving us all the update. I'm trying not to be depressed, but my question relates to where the Planning and Infrastructure Bill leaves the responsibilities around nationally significant infrastructure projects. Having spent a year redoing Thames Water's biodiversity net gain calculations relating to the proposed Abingdon Reservoir, I rather think I might have wasted my time, because it sounds like there aren't going to be many enforceable responsibilities left in terms of salvaging nature in the immediate environment of the proposed reservoir.
Well, each question prompts me to say something that I didn't manage to say in the main bit. And one of the good things that the government is finally doing is bringing forward biodiversity net gain for major infrastructure projects. So I don't know their timeline, but knowing the Abingdon Reservoir and how how long it takes, I hope that BNG for NSIPs will be in place by then. I don't think the planning bill will affect the Abingdon site, because I don't think it's a protected site. So I think you'll still be in